Chapter 29 was the transition over to King Hezekiah. He began to reign and he cleansed the temple as well as the people. There was sacrifice and song and joy in Judah, and that was the bulk of the chapter. Here in chapter 30, they're going to celebrate the Passover. So King Hezekiah sends letters to all Israel and Judah, urging them to gather in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. The king and the assembly decide to hold it in the second month due to some logistical issues, as well as insufficient numbers of people cleansed. So they're going to give them a bit more time, but the couriers are dispatched to spread the message. Some scoff at it, though some humble themselves and join the celebration. The Passover is eventually observed with great joy and generosity, and the event brings unprecedented joy to Jerusalem, reminiscent of Solomon's era. The priests bless the people, and their prayers are heard by God. And that's roughly the overview of this chapter. And of course, there's going to be questions about the historicity of this event from some of the scholars. And so some, especially the more critical types, are going to argue that this Passover by Hezekiah is modeled after the later one by Josiah. But there's problems with that view. Let me just go ahead and hit part of the conclusion from Dillard's commentary, or rather it's Selman. And he says, firstly, it is to be noted that Hezekiah's festival is marked by various irregularities, such as a date in the second rather than the first month, a duration of 2 weeks rather than one, and the impurity of some of the participants. These were issues of considerable importance and are not likely to have been invented by a writer such as the chronicler who was meticulous about cultic matters. And we'll hit this in more detail below, but it is important to note that they don't follow things exactly to the letter. They're following things more in the spirit of the celebration. And for the chronicler, that's kind of surprising because of how orthodox the book is. But that is rather important theologically as well. But Selman continues, secondly, the two Passovers vary in several important details. These variations show that Hezekiah's Passover cannot have been written up on the basis of Josiah's. So there's good reason to take this as is. But I do want to hit, as part of the overview, at least two things that are worth considering. Let me go back up here. Dillard is pointing out, and all the commentators point out, just how heavily dependent this chapter is on Solomon's prayer in 2 Chronicles 7, specifically verse 14, which reads, "If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal their land." Again, all the commentators are going to point out this language is all over this chapter. There's humble, pray, seek, turn, hear, heal. As God had promised, the prayer uttered at the temple would be heard in heaven. And so now that they've restored the temple, they now turn to the promises God made at the founding of the temple, that he would hear their prayers if they sought him. And one more issue I want to hit, broadly speaking, is the structure of this section. It's actually really interesting. Probably not surprising to you that it is chiastic if you've followed along with any of these videos. But really, it's a chiasm within the chiasm within the chiasm. It just kind of keeps going deeper and deeper. So as an overview here, Lightheart in page 212 and 213 is pointing out these observations. He says that verses 1 through 12 are a chiasm. Now within that chiasm, the center of it is verses 6 through 9, which is Hezekiah's decree. That decree itself is chiastic. And within that chiasm, verses 6 and 9 each are neatly paralleled. Verse 9 is a chiasm. Verse 6 is a little bit different. It's ABC, ABC, and we'll see that below. So here's the first 12 verses. Hezekiah sends invitations to assemble for Passover, and that's mirrored by some from Israel come, and Judah responds with one heart. Then you have runners take the invitation throughout the land, and B prime, runners go from city to city, and some of them are met with mockery. And then at the center is the decree by the king, the command. And so this sinner, C, is itself chiastic. Return to Yahweh, that he may return to you. Do not be like your fathers and brothers doing ma'al. Do not stiffen the neck, but give hand to him. This is compared in one of the lexicons as like shaking the hand. That kind of idea. And A prime, so his anger will turn. So turn to Yahweh, or return to Yahweh, so that his anger will turn away from you. And here in A, we also have this paralleled structure here. And this is all of verse 6. It reads, return to Yahweh, Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He will return to the survivors and remnant from the palm of Assyria. And then verse 9 is chiastic. In your returning to Yahweh, your brothers and sons will find compassion before captors to return to this land, for Yahweh is compassionate and will not remove his face if you return to him. So just a very neatly structured section. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read everything. I'll just kind of summarize as I move along. But it should be noted straight away that this sent to all Israel and Judah language, it is kind of interesting because even though the chronicler hasn't really been bringing up the north at this point, as Merrill's pointing out, circa around 715 BC, the Assyrians had already sacked Samaria and had deported thousands of Israelites to various parts of their empire, leaving a greatly reduced, but by no means totally decimated, population. And some of that will come up in the letter that Hezekiah is going to send. And Dillard is pointing out here that part of this, verses 2 through 5, is a bit of a flashback because it's going back to some of the things we just hit in the last chapter, how the priests had not consecrated themselves in sufficient number. And so this is why they push the Passover into the second month. And this is something that was actually done in the broader law in general anyway. If people were unclean or I think even traveling, there was a second Passover that could be taken, but it's being applied on a national scale. But it's going to give them time to purify themselves as well as some of the sojourners to travel to Judah. And so to verse 5, so they decree to make a proclamation throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, that the people should come and keep the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel, at Jerusalem, for they had not kept it as often as prescribed. So let's take a look at some of this. Now, this language here, Johnstone's pointing out, send a proclamation throughout all Israel. He says there's significant resonances in this expression, especially when it is taken in conjunction with the conclusion of the whole Passover narrative at the end of 2 Chronicles 31:1. So the first verse of the next chapter. All the Israelites returned each to his holding. The proclamation throughout the land of the return of each to his ancestral holding is part of the eschatological expectations associated with Jubilee in Leviticus 25:9-10. There are echoes of that expectation in the conclusion of Chronicles' whole work in the proclamation of Cyrus. Here, in the celebration of the Passover in the time of Hezekiah, there is an interim realization of that hope and an anticipation of that final homecoming, just as every Passover is an anticipation of the next year in Jerusalem. And it's probably also worth thinking about that even though they do return even under Cyrus, there was still this feeling of spiritual exile that continued through the Second Temple period until the time of Christ. And so the presence of God never really returned to them until it returned in the person of Jesus Christ, who of course they rejected and missed. And even that, though, looks forward to the final cycle of all this, the second coming. And it is worth noting, although I need to look at it again, but I remember Heiser making this point that he had an astronomer friend that taught him how to find what years would have been Jubilee years. And so he took a 3 BC birth date for Jesus, which has a lot of explanatory power going for it. But he said he looked that up, interested if that was a Jubilee year, and it wasn't. He was kind of disappointed, but he found that, I want to say it was the year Jesus would have began his ministry. That would have been a Jubilee year, which is very interesting. But that dovetails nicely with this idea of the end of exile and this eschatological hope, and how so much of it is tied to Jubilees and Jubilee cycles and things like that. But continuing on, moving down to the end of verse 5, we have this line, "For they had not kept it as often as prescribed." Let's do a text comparison, because this gets translated a number of different ways. So the NASB, "For they had not celebrated in great numbers as it was prescribed." So the question is it as often or in great numbers? And that could be taken either way. Let's see, who is this? Dillard. He says the statement that Passover had not been celebrated in such large numbers according to what was written is difficult to assess. Obviously, larger numbers were possible with the participation of pilgrims from the north, and the statement may intend simply to note record attendance. On the other hand, the contrast may be with the private or familial observance also associated with Passover, and he cites a number of Exodus passages. The passage may intend to say that this was the first observance in Mass at the sanctuary, as envisaged by Deuteronomy 16, 1-8. It was, of course, the first observance of Passover as a united people since the days of Solomon. See the comments at verse 26. The appeal to what was written suggests that the provisions of Deuteronomy 16 were in view. So I guess he takes more or less that view that it's more about this national observation as opposed to the private family one. And then moving down to verse 6 and following. So the couriers went throughout all Israel and Judah with letters from the king and his princes, as the king had commanded, saying, O people of Israel, return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that he may turn again to the remnant of you who have escaped from the hand of the kings of Assyria. Do not be like your fathers and your brothers, who were faithless to the Lord God of their fathers, so that he made them a desolation, as you see. Do not now be stiff-necked, as your fathers were, but yield yourselves to the Lord and come to his sanctuary, which he has consecrated forever, and serve the Lord your God, that his fierce anger may turn away from you. For if you return to the Lord, your brothers and your children will find compassion with their captors and return to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful, and will not turn away his face from you if you return to him. And this letter here is dominated by this language of return and turning. As you can see, it highlights throughout this section. I like this note here by Williamson. He writes, the repeated appeal not to be like your fathers is to be understood against the background of the chronicler's doctrine of individual retribution. There is evidence from the literature of the post-exilic period that despair often beset the community of Jerusalem because they felt that they were heirs to a situation which left them in every way in such a low state that full restoration was no longer possible and therefore no longer worth striving for. If you're familiar at all with the modern concept, they were collapsitarians. They were people that just wanted to see everything crumble. Because things are so doomed, you may as well speed up the process. But continuing with Williamson, he says, the emphasis of the chronicler in the present passage, however, points in quite the opposite direction. Each generation stands or falls on its own merits before God, whose ability to intervene dramatically has been frequently noted. Thus he appeals to his readers to turn from a deadening obsession with the failures of the past and to grasp the possibilities of the present and future by yielding to the Lord with the full assurance that he is gracious and merciful. But this is a point that we've hit, especially in the last couple of chapters with the last couple of kings, that you're not bound by your past. And it kind of cuts both ways, because you can have a righteous king have a wicked son, but you can also have a wicked father and be a righteous man. And we've seen that through this last series of kings. And so ultimately you are responsible for seeking after God and trusting God. And Johnstone is commenting, especially on this return type of language. The verb to return is a major linking theme. The force of the verb is sacramental. As you turn, so he turns. The play on the meaning of the verb is coupled in verse 9 with a play on the noun participle for captors. And we'll take a look at that in a second. The actions of your fathers and your brothers are linked to the fate of your brothers and your children. The defrauding of God in verse 7 can be made good by the recognition of God's prerogatives, his holy place which he has made holy forever in verse 8. I like the way he translates that, because here in the ESV it says his sanctuary which he has consecrated forever. This is one of those times where I wish they would pick a word and stick with it, because it's talking about that QDS root. We saw this in the last chapter as well. So if you say sanctuary here, you should say which he has sanctified forever, or something to that effect. Johnstone says holy place, which he has made holy. So you get that repeated language. And here Johnstone was pointing out the language of captors and the return language. Visually, you can see it here, the potential pun between these two words. But I think I had another note in here. And this was in Johnstone's Volume 1 commentary. When he was commenting on Solomon's prayer, on one of Solomon's prayers, he says, strikingly repent and restore come from the same root. In sacramental theology, if they return, they shall be granted a return. But within the context of Chronicles as a whole, that petition can only be answered in the end time. So it's eschatological. And of course, as we noted just a moment ago, it's ultimately eschatological in a messianic sense. And Klein is going to more or less make similar observations, although it is worth pointing out here that you have this phrase, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. This title is used in only two other places in the Old Testament, by Elijah in 1 Kings 18:36, and that's versus the prophets of Baal, and by David in 1 Chronicles 29:18. And then moving down to verse 10 and following, the couriers go out from city to city through the country of Ephraim, Manasseh, and as far as Zebulun, but they laughed at them to scorn and mocked them. It is kind of interesting here. I hadn't picked up on this, but Lightheart points out here that the invitation is not altogether welcome. As in Jesus' parable of the wedding feast, many of the invitees mock the king's command, but some do come. They accept the invitation and humble themselves. But concerning this laughing and mocking scorn language, Johnstone says the unique conjugation of the verb to make sport of, or to scorn or to laugh at, whatever, is perhaps to distinguish this negative reaction from the use of the same root in a different conjugation of the approved action of David in 1 Chronicles 13:8 and 15:29. And so these are both instances, maybe before the ark specifically, but these are where David's dancing and stuff like that. It's like festive type language. Again, these are clearly positive, and this one's pretty clearly negative. And then we get down to verse 11. However, some men of Asher, really some shouldn't be there, men of Asher, of Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. Williamson is noting here that qualifying language like a few or some are unnecessary. That the chronicler did not take such a pessimistic view is demonstrated by verse 18. So further down, it's going to make that point that a majority of the people, many of them from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Issachar, Zebulun, so on and so forth. So they actually did have a decent response, it would seem. For whatever reason, though, many translations like to qualify the number in a small way. And then verse 12 is interesting. The hand of God was also on Judah to give them one heart, to do what the king and the princes commanded by the word of the Lord. I could certainly see this being used as like a Calvinistic proof text. But there's at least a few things worth noting with this, because this one heart language, it is rather rare, and it does seem to be a divine gift, we'll put it that way. I know it shows up in Ezekiel. It may show up in some of those heart of stone type passages. But the last time we saw the heart language was at the end of last chapter, or in last chapter. So as we move up here, verse, I think it's 31, and the assembly brought sacrifices and thank offerings, and all who were of a willing heart brought burnt offerings. So here you have the assembly bringing sacrifices and thank offerings, this is not the posture of a reprobate. Basically, these are people that have been now seeking the Lord. They've turned from their wickedness. And so if we wanted to use maybe the modern Protestant nomenclature, we would say this isn't so much a Ordo Salutis type passage. This is more so not about justification, but about sanctification. These are already people that have repented, and now God is supernaturally guiding them to be of one heart. And because this one heart type language, again, it is pretty rare, but when it shows up, like it showed up early on with David, where the people were of one heart to make David king, stuff like that. But the point being, there's no need to take this kind of language deterministically. And then verse 13, and many people came together in Jerusalem to keep the feast of unleavened bread in the second month. And as Klein points out here, and this is the first mention of unleavened bread, an inclusive term that represents both Passover and the 7 days of unleavened bread. In verse 14, they set to work and removed the altars that were in Jerusalem, and all the altars of burning incense they took away and threw into the brook Kidron. Now, this is very likely not the same altars that we saw in last chapter. As I write here, these would seem to be altars that Ahaz had set up in every corner of Jerusalem. In the last chapter, they had already discarded the altars in the temple itself. So they're purging the rest of Jerusalem. In verse 15, they slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the second month, and the priests and the Levites were ashamed, so that they consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings into the house of the Lord. This language is kind of odd here, that the priests and the Levites were ashamed. And Johnstone writes, the text then takes a surprising turn. The priests and Levites are ashamed. At first sight, it is as though they were put to shame by the zeal of the pilgrims. But the more likely explanation is given in verses 17 and 18, which itself reads, there were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore the Levites had to slaughter the Passover lamb for everyone who was not clean, to consecrate it to the Lord. For a majority of the people, many of them from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves, yet they ate the Passover otherwise than as prescribed. And it's going to continue, but we'll return back. So Johnston thinks that those verses serve as a better explanation for what's going on. Inevitably, among such a large influx of pilgrims, of whom the majority are from the polluted north, there are many who are not in a state of ritual cleanness. The priests are scandalized. So that's how he takes their shame. They're not shamed for themselves. They're scandalized. They're basically ashamed for the people or of the people. And so he says, verse 16 may refer not to the precautionary measure they now take to make atonement. Whole burnt offerings are surprising in connection with Passover, but rather to the measures they have already undertaken to sanctify themselves and the sanctuary by offering whole burnt offerings at the altar in the approved manner. But this is really interesting because we get to this crucial moment where the northerners have arrived, but they're not in a state really to participate because they're impure. And Lightheart writing of this says, many from Ephraim, Manasseh, so on and so forth, they show up to Jerusalem. They have been worshiping golden calves and Baals for generations, and they have not purified themselves, yet they eat the Passover anyway, otherwise than written. It is a ma'al, a sacrilege, an intrusion on God's holiness. And in Chronicles, a ma'al is usually followed by an outbreak of wrath. Hezekiah averts that result by asking pardon. And he points out that the term is related to our term for atonement. It is a remarkable circumvention of normal procedure. Instead of performing a rite of covering atonement, Hezekiah simply prays. As Yahweh promised Solomon, he hears and answers and heals the people. And Johnstone makes a similar point. He says, at this critical moment, Hezekiah appeals to the principle he has already laid down in his letter. Compare verse 9. Each one who seeks the Lord, the God of his fathers, with a pure intention will find that the Lord is gracious and forgiving. And he points out the usage of key terminology. The Lord is good and can himself, beyond any rites of the sanctuary, effect atonement. And so it is rather interesting that in a book that filters everything through the lens of here's how we're supposed to do things to return to that former glory. And we're going to do so by being orthodox, by worshiping the Lord and worshiping Him correctly. That in a moment like this, they set aside the finer details of the law. And what matters is their heart and the fact that they're repentant and seeking the Lord. And so it's a moment that really, I don't think can be understated how somewhat surprising it is that it takes this turn. And so it's more about following the spirit of the law than the letter. And so Hezekiah prays, saying, "May the good Lord pardon everyone who sets his heart to seek God, the Lord, the God of his fathers, even though not according to the sanctuary's rules of cleanness." Literally in Hebrew, not according to the cleanness of holiness. Verse 20, "And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. And the people of Israel who were present at Jerusalem kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with great gladness. And the Levites and the priests praised the Lord day by day, singing with all their might to the Lord. And Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to all the Levites who showed good skill in the service of the Lord. So they ate the food of the festival for 7 days, sacrificing peace offerings and giving thanks to the Lord, the God of their fathers." Klein here again is noting this connection with Solomon's prayer in 2 Chronicles 7:14. And he writes, "Healed" here no doubt includes the atonement, that is forgiveness, mentioned in verse 18. The call to repentance in verses 6 through 9 is a clear restatement of the doctrine of retribution. Return to Yahweh so that He may return to the remnant of you. When you return to Yahweh, your kinsmen and your children will find mercy before their captors, and Yahweh will not turn His face away from you if you return to Him. And so the message of Hezekiah's decree that he sends out to the people is fulfilled here in this prayer, that the Lord sees and hears and heals them. It may be worth pointing out here that there's great joy in this celebration of this feast, and Klein points out that great joy marked this observance. This is the only time that the Bible associates joy with this festival, except for Ezra 6:22, where Yahweh had turned the heart of the king of Assyria so that He helped them with the temple. So perhaps a connection between these events. And then they sing here with all their might to the Lord, or however you're going to translate that. And I want to take a look at Kleinig's comment on this particular phrase. And so he's interacting with the way people in the past have translated this stuff. But we'll just hit his conclusion. He says, "It seems to me that the instruments were regarded as powerful because they belonged to the Lord. They were powerful in two ways. They were powerful in their effect upon the people by using them in praise. The musicians proclaimed the Lord's goodness to the people and so motivated them to rejoice with much jubilation." And so once again, we see here the music producing an effect on the people. We saw this last chapter. Like the ark with its power, they were also powerful instruments for evoking the Lord's presence and power. There is, as is shown in 1 Chronicles 16, 8 through 34, a connection between divine empowerment and the performance of praise. Those who sought the Lord at the ark in Jerusalem could also seek His saving power there. Now, the proper way for seeking the Lord's presence was by ascribing glory and strength to Him through the presentation of offerings and praises. Both strength and joy come from Him and are given to those who acknowledge His sovereignty in their praise. So since the musical instruments moved the people to present their offerings to the Lord with thanksgiving, they were powerful in conveying His power and joy to them through the performance of sacred song. The musical instruments were therefore an important component in the ritual performance of praise. By virtue of their divine institution, those instruments which belonged to the Lord were powerful in fulfilling the ritual purpose for which they were instituted. While each set of instruments had its own task to perform, they all combined, each in its own way, to announce the Lord to His people, to proclaim His presence with them, and to praise Him for His goodness. So there's also debate about this phrase, that the Levites who showed good skill in the service of the Lord. Johnstone says that that might either mean who impart good understanding for the Lord, referring to their teaching role, or who sing psalms with good understanding to the Lord, referring to their role as musicians. And then he points out a dozen psalm titles, for example, 42, 44, 45, 52, use the same term. And then down to verse 23, then the whole assembly agreed together to keep the feast for another 7 days. So they kept it for another 7 days with gladness. And then it gets into their offerings, and the priests consecrated themselves in great numbers. In verse 25, the whole assembly of Judah and the priests and the Levites and the whole assembly that came out of Israel, and the sojourners who came out of the land of Israel, and the sojourners who lived in Judah rejoiced. So here it includes everybody. So you have Judah's kahal, their assembly, but it also has Israel's kahal. And then you have sojourners coming from the north, as well as sojourners, travelers from also Judah. And concerning this phrase, out of the land of Israel, Dillard points out Israel is reunited under Hezekiah in the chronicler's eyes, not only in having one king and temple, but also in its geographical extent, embracing the land from Beersheba to Dan. The chronicler uses the phrase land of Israel on only 4 occasions, one each during the reign of David, Solomon, Hezekiah, and Josiah, all periods when the land was defined in its traditional extent. And then following in verse 26, we have an explicit reference back to Solomon and David. There was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. Then the priests and the Levites arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came to his holy habitation in heaven. And we'll close out here with Johnstone. He says, it is a blessing, but though blessing the people is one of the prerogatives of the high priest, it may rather have been a prayer for the blessing of the people rather than a direct blessing of the people themselves. Thus, it is immediately called a prayer which reaches to his holy dwelling, to the heavens. For the heavens as the place sacramentally linked to the temple, city, and land, where the Lord hears prayer. See Solomon's prayer in 2 Chronicles 6:21. And parenthetically, this is interesting because he points out this phrase, his holy habitation in heaven. It's used in Deuteronomy 26:15, precisely in connection with the payment of tithes, which is to be the subject in the next section, 31:5. But we will pick that up next time with Hezekiah organizing the priests.